Okay, all right, this works. Okay, good afternoon, happy Friday. Hope everyone's well. What I would like to do, this is a bit of an experiment of sorts, so thank you very much for coming, even though it's Friday and it's nice weather outside and all that, so that's appreciated. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about the events which have led up to and are leading up to the elections which are taking place in Myanmar very soon. And before I go too much further, I do want to thank a few people, including Cedric, Indra, and Mikkel, for helping me out with this particular research. This research is based on 2 trips that I've made to Myanmar, both to Yangon and to Naypyidaw, so I just wanted to give my thanks. So not to get too heavily into statistics or anything, because this is Friday, but I just want to give, first of all, a bit of an overview of the country that we're speaking of. This is a country which is going to be going through a very significant transition of various types, which I'll be getting to. It is a pretty fascinating case study, and it's very interesting to look at the change in the country that has taken place since 2010. This will be, the election coming up on November 8th, probably one of the most pivotal in the country's history, simply because it is the most inclusive. The last election that took place 5 years ago was not considered to be particularly free and fair. The main opposition party boycotted, but now we have a much more inclusive election where the main opposition is taking part. So I won't go into this in depth, but as you can see, Myanmar is undergoing not only a political change, but also a considerable social and economic one. So when we talk about reform in the country, you see a lot of news articles talking about, the big transition in Myanmar, the big set of reform in Myanmar. But first of all, it's important to note that when we talk about reform, we're actually talking about 4 separate processes, all going on at the same time, which even one would be an extremely difficult undertaking for any country. And yet Myanmar is having to undertake these 4 sets of reforms all at the same time. So it's very difficult for me or for anyone else to predict what is going to be happening after November. What we are probably going to be seeing is a very difficult post-election transition process. So what are the 4 transitions that we're talking about? Well, first of all, we are talking about a transition from a mixed, I guess you can call it mixed, system of civilian military rule, which has been the norm over the past 5 years, to the promise, and I do underscore the word promise, of full civilian government over a particular amount of time. This is going to be a very complicated process because the Myanmar military, or Tatmadaw, has had a considerable amount of pull over the Myanmar government over the past few decades. So this will be a very distinct transition. This will also involve, I should add, the creation of democratic institutions, which have simply not existed before. Civil society, liberal institutions are all having to be created, or in some cases recreated from scratch in a very short time period. So this alone is quite the big challenge. Second point is the end, or hopeful end, of the significant number of civil conflicts which have been taking place in the country for many decades. Most of these conflicts that we're talking about have place along Burma's periphery, border regions with China, with Thailand, with Bangladesh, with India. The peace process, and this is something which NUPI has been working on for quite some time, is also a very complicated process. There are many actors involved, many actors who have been engaging in armed rebellion against the government for many decades, and they would need to be brought into any kind of political solution, again, in a very short time for the reform process to work. Then you have the third point, and this sometimes gets a bit lost. This is a transitional economy. This is an economy which has been suffering from poverty and inequality for a very long time. And there is the hope that if the elections go well, a great deal of new foreign investment will be entering into the country from East Asia, from Europe, from the United States. Like, many countries are kind of sitting on the edge of the stage, waiting to see how well the elections go, and then waiting to jump into a market of about 51 million people. So it's a very significant market, and as you can see from the map, it is also very strategically located. It is the crossroads between India and China, 2 obviously very big markets. We're already starting to see some countries, including Norway, begin the investment process in the hopes that the elections and the reform go well. But as I'm going to be explaining briefly later, the economic transition is quite the big undertaking. There is a lot to overcome before this can succeed. And the fourth point is foreign policy, which is how I entered the case study from, looking at China and Myanmar. After many decades of near total isolation, Myanmar is opening up. It is having to completely recreate its foreign policy interests. It is going to need specialists. It is going to need a lot of data about international relations, which simply wasn't there. This was a country in severe isolation. So a lot of foreign policy reform is having to take place all at once, especially if the elections go well, more investment comes in, more aid comes in. All of this is going to have to be handled. So these are the challenges that Myanmar are facing. 4 very, very big jobs that are going to have to be completed successfully in a short time. So you understand why I'm a little hesitant to start talking about future trends or results yet. So just to talk a little bit about the elections themselves. These will be elections for both the lower and the upper house of parliament. So the lower house in the Myanmar parliament, 440 seats. The upper house has 224. But due to the last constitutional change, which I believe was about 5 years ago, the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, is guaranteed by law a quarter of all seats in both lower house. So that gives them an automatic pull within both sets of parliament. So whichever way the election goes, the military will still be involved in the post-November reform process, at least for now. This also means that any kind of majority rule will be that much more complicated. The question of when the Myanmar military will begin to go back to the barracks, to use the international relations term, is a bit of an open question. When I talked to military actors in Naypyidaw, the line that was given, the word that was given, was that once the military is satisfied that the democratic transition is well on its way, that the country is stable, that the peace process is holding, they will begin the process of a phased pullout from the Myanmar political system. When that is going to happen is an open question, though. We don't know at what point that will take place, and there is some skepticism as to the viability of the timetable. But nevertheless, that is the promise. Now, one of the reasons why I also went to Jakarta very recently, just after going to Myanmar, was that our sister organization in Jakarta, the Center for Security and International Studies in Jakarta, is very interested in the military to civilian reform process. This is something which Indonesia went through not that long ago. So Indonesia is hoping to present itself as a model. So the vote itself will be taking place on 8th of November. It is being overseen by the Union Election Commission. There was a bit of a hiccup about 2 weeks ago when C suggested that perhaps it would not be a bad idea for the elections to be postponed. The reason for this was the very severe storms, flooding, which took place in the country back in August. This has led to considerable damage, especially in the western end of the country. So you have many parts of the west which are still suffering from major flood damage. The UEC backed down from that. The election will still take place on the 8th. The election itself will be first past the post. So it will be a single-member constituent setup. That was to avoid too much chaos in terms of too many parties getting a role. There's also this has also been referred to as a relative majority system. Candidate with the highest number of votes is given constituency, and the president will be chosen afterwards through an electoral college system. So it's a very interesting set of hoops that are being undertaken. At the same time, regional assemblies, they will be voting their representatives in at the same time. And it is very likely that after the vote, there is going to be a considerable amount, not only of settling in, but of compromise and deal-making. For the simple reason that whichever party gets in, there is going to need to be some kind of accommodation with the military. Now, the 2 major parties that are contesting out of an estimated 97, about 97 parties have registered. Most of these parties are either single issue or very geographically limited, so the only 2 parties that I think are going to play a significant role, I could be wrong, first of all, the ruling party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the USDP, and the National League of Democracy, headed by Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi, the main opposition force, which has obviously had a long and extremely difficult history with both the military and the current government. Ms. Suu Kyi is not eligible to be president. There was a constitutional amendment a few years ago which said that any Myanmar citizen who has either foreign spouse or foreign children cannot stand as president. And considering the selectivity of this particular clause, one wonders if, a particular person was in mind when this was put through. So that is a problem right there. What role will she play? Assuming the NLD wins a significant amount of seats, and that's the way it's looking, what will be her role? There's some talk about her being speaker. There's some talk about maybe changing the constitution again so she can be president. Or she may be an eminence grise, a power behind the throne. This is something which everyone will be looking at very carefully. There's also been a lot of back and forth between the NLD and the ruling party. Like, for example, a few months ago, the chair of the USDP government was forcibly stripped of his title. He was accused of being too reformist or going a little bit too far away from the party line and being a bit too willing to potentially open negotiations with the NLD. So again, there's going to be a lot of horse trading and dealing very likely after November. Now, how many voters are there? There's about 30 million eligible voters, and I use the word about with very large quotation marks. The rules are, and I had a chance to meet with the election committee when I was in NUPI, interesting experience. So who can vote? Anyone over 18 years of age, a Myanmar citizen, or a landed so-called associate citizen, someone who has landed immigrant status can vote, assuming the proper paperwork. There are some exceptions. Members of religious orders, including monks and nuns, are not eligible. Those who are judged to be mentally unfit, those in prison, and also, and this had to be explained to me a few times because it's a bit odd, those who have not resolved their bankruptcy, who have declared bankruptcy and haven't resolved it, or anyone who has lied about their income status. Specifically, if you underinflate your income, you can be told, sorry, you can't vote. How this is going to go about, I'd very much like to know more about. So, the other problem, though, actually there's several problems, is the issues of registration. And many countries, including Norway, have been very actively involved in getting out, not only making sure that the elections go well, but also getting information. We're talking about a country that has not had a vote of this magnitude for a very, very long time, not the least as far back as 1990. There are going to be problems with certain areas that will be unable to vote, especially in Kachin and Shan State. The reason for this is that these parts of the country are still extremely unstable, with militia activities very high. Nonetheless, there are attempts to make sure that as many people can vote as possible. There have been some problems, though, with people being left off the voter roll, with people being judged not eligible to vote who are contesting this, and those without proper paperwork. So how many people will be able to vote is still a very good question. The final results of the vote, when it takes place, hopefully all goes well, will be released on the 22nd of November. But whether there will be any kind of difficulties over people able to vote is an open question. Now, getting back to the area of education, I also had a chance to have a very good conversation with the Embassy of Switzerland in Yangon. What they have done is to set up what they call a code of conduct. This is designed to educate voters and citizens about what their rights are, but it is also a pledge that each of the parties, the 90 or so parties, are being asked to take in order to avoid any kind of illegal activity, any kind of harassment, any kind of threats of violence. In other words, to run a fair campaign as much as possible. Most of the parties, I heard about 80 or so, have signed. There have been, again, some bumps and scrapes in this process, but Switzerland has been very active in making sure that the process goes as smoothly as possible. The contribution by Norway, I should also point out, Norway has also been extremely active in the process. Norway, just as a quick trivia point, is also providing the link, which voters are expected to use once they vote, so that's a contribution. And Norway, as well as other countries in Western Europe, are going to be monitoring the vote very carefully. Now, what was hoped in the weeks leading up to the election was that, and I'm getting on to the second point here, that a ceasefire between the Myanmar government and the major actors, the major ethnic militias, especially in the north, would be completed by the time of the vote. That would obviously give the government quite a big boost in popularity. This has not been completely successful. There was a limited accord. It was struck on October 15th, but only about 8 of the 16 groups involved actually signed on. There are still many groups, including some along the Chinese border, who have not signed on yet. Some of these are going to be especially difficult in terms of the peace-building process. So we're talking about the Kachin Independence Organization and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance. They are far leftist. There's also been a bit of back and forth in terms of which countries can successfully oversee the ceasefire. China is very much involved, but since that time, Japan and the EU have also asked to play a more prominent role. Adding to the complication, this is also going to affect the vote, is the situation in this particular state, Rakhine. In Rakhine, there is a group of individuals who have been called a minority group. They've also been called refugees. They've been called illegal immigrants. They've been called many things. In the media, there are references to Rohingya. Now, Rohingya are Muslims who can trace mostly their ancestry back to Bangladesh, who have immigrated from Bangladesh at various times. According to international groups, especially international rights groups, the Rohingya are a minority in the country and that they are subject to persecution. The fact that they have not been added to the voter docket is a big issue. According to many members of the Myanmar government, including some of the people I spoke to, the Rohingya do not exist, at least not as an ethnic group. They are very commonly referred to as either Bengali or Bangladeshi, those who have either crossed the border illegally or have not clarified their citizenship status. This is a very, very contentious issue, which became very international a few months ago when Muslim refugees, Bengali Rohingya refugees, began to take to boats requesting refugee status elsewhere in Southeast Asia. On top of this, there is also the problem of extreme Buddhist nationalism. There is a group known as the Mabata who have been extremely critical and extremely inflammatory in their views towards Burmese nationalism, have been extremely critical of the very idea of Rohingya. This group does have a great deal of visibility, and most of the major political groups, including the NLD, have been criticized for not directly condemning this organization. So the final point I want to make has to do with the question of foreign policy. But before I do that, there's one more picture I wanted to show. There we go. When I visited the Electoral Commission, I got a chance to look at some sample ballots. Now, this one on the right is a ballot which, it's a sample ballot from the 2010 vote. So you can see that there is a party name, party symbol, and places to mark ballot. The one on the right is going to be, this is a sample of the ballots that are going to be used on November 8th. Stamps are going to be used for the first time. People will not check. They'll actually be able to use stamps this time around. And the counting process is expected to be streamlined. How that is going to work, though, especially because we're talking about a very large area and a lot of population which will need to be covered in one day, is a bit of an open question. So finally, foreign policy. I said before that many parts of the international community are very curious and very interested in the results of this election, especially in the West, especially the United States and Western Europe. Myanmar is going to have to alter its foreign policy quite a bit to take into account the fact that so many countries are now willing to engage the country, that the country is coming out of its long isolation. There are going to be some challenges, though. Like I said, this is a country which, even though 51 million is quite large, it is sandwiched between two great powers with very often differing agendas. In the case of China, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, there have been a bit of a deterioration at times of the relationship between the two. There have been some border problems. There have been some issues with smuggling and transnational crime. Recently, there's also been problems with illegal logging. And this has definitely caused a bit of a dent in a relationship which used to be considered very close, especially late 1980s, early 90s, when China was one of the few countries that had still very old relations with the Myanmar government. That said, trade between China and Myanmar is still very high. It is very unlikely that we're going to be seeing any kind of drop in economic relations between the two. And China, like I said, is very heavily involved in the ceasefire process. India is another issue, though. What is happening in India right now, and I had a chance to talk to the ambassador when I was in Yangon, India is trying to make up for a lot of lost ground. India did not have a very strong diplomatic presence in Myanmar up until recently. India is now going over many ways of improving its status, including developing communications and roadways, which are very limited in that part of the country, looking at ways to develop educational programs, various other areas. We are also looking at a huge amount of interest from ASEAN. Even though Myanmar has been an ASEAN member for quite some time, many countries, including Indonesia and Thailand, have been encouraged to update educational programs, to update increased diplomacy. And ASEAN very likely will be playing a role in any kind of reform that takes place from there. What we're seeing now is a very, very difficult process of foreign relations development. As many of you know, Norway has been involved in the diplomatic process in Myanmar for a long time. I noticed that as soon as I got off the plane and noticed all the Telenor ads in the airport and beyond there. So Norway is very much involved, but in talking to some groups, including some civil society groups in Yangon, I was given kind of a mixed impression about Norway's presence in Myanmar so far. On one hand, Norway has been praised for being a peacemaker, a peace builder, but some opposition groups have been very unhappy with the willingness of the Norwegian government to directly deal with the military and the current government. So, and there has been also a call, and I heard this when I was visiting the university, for Norway to up its game a little bit and perhaps engage in further educational programs, educational exchanges. So that's something which might be looked at in the future if all goes well. There's also going to be a lot of potential for new investment, and that is going to be very critical because this is a country, like I said, that is facing a huge amount of poverty and a huge amount of corruption. Just this morning, as I was getting my notes together, there was a report released by a British organization, Global Witness, arguing that the jade trade in Myanmar has really gotten out of control in terms of its regulation, that the jade trade is worth approximately 31 billion, about half, close to half of Myanmar's total GDP. A lot of it is unregulated. A lot of the money is just getting lost in various corrupt networks, and the profits from the jade trade are simply not reaching the people. So that is one issue, very big issue, that is going to have to be dealt with. So if the elections go well, if we do see a huge amount of investment in the country over the coming year, how best to make sure that the money goes to the people who need it? And that is going to be a challenge not only for Norway, but for everybody. And the last point I want to make is that this is a country which is starting to go back to some of its roots during the pre-1980s days. Myanmar was founded on the principle of non-alignment. And if you go to the foreign ministry in Naypyidaw, it's a very big new building, very impressive looking. But you will see this plaque in English and in Myanmarese in the foyer. And I don't know if you can read it, but it essentially says that the Union practices an independent, active, and non-aligned foreign policy. So this is a country which is really trying to spread its foreign policy wings. So these are the 4 challenges that this country is undertaking. And like I said, trying to make a prediction of what's happening after the 8th is going to be, I hesitate to do that. I do know that it is going to be a very bumpy process. I know it is going to require a great deal of compromise and deal making, and it probably will require a great deal of help and assistance from the outside communities. So all I will say is I'll keep my fingers crossed. Thank you.